With us today is our presenter, Nancy Stadler-Salt, Great Lakes Program Coordinator with Environment Canada. Nancy has a Bachelor of Science and a certificate in atmospheric studies. She began her career with Environment Canada as a meteorologist and then made the switch from air to water in 1995. Nancy has been involved with State of the Lakes ecosystem conferences, Great Lakes indicators, and the resulting State of the Great Lakes reports for 9 cycles, and is currently leading the 10th conference and reporting cycle. Also along the way, Nancy has had the good fortune to be able to manage one of the jewels of the Great Lakes, Lake Superior, in order to protect and restore the lake's ecosystems in collaboration with many amazing partners. She is constantly in awe of the beauty and power of all of the Great Lakes. Before I hand it over to Nancy, I'd just like to give you an idea of who else is tuning into this webinar with you. I have to admit, I always really enjoy looking over the registration list for these webinars to see who is joining us. Today, we have some regulars, and I think you know who you are, and also quite a few new people. I think this speaks to the broad interest in the topics such as Great Lakes indicators, and as well as some of the promotion that I know some of our partners have done. People who registered for this webinar include those from various Canadian and American universities, federal government departments, provincial governments, various U.S. federal and state government agencies, consulting organizations, and some fellow think tanks. So welcome to all of you. And before we start, I'd like to go over just a few ground rules. I'd like to ask everyone to please keep their microphones off during the webinar, just to keep the background noise down. If you don't know how to mute the microphone on your computer, that's okay. We can do so on our end with the webinar controls. And you were automatically muted by the system when you logged in, so you're probably good right now anyway. Also, we will have a question and answer session after the presentation. If you do have a question, I ask that you please type it into the chat window. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to demonstrate that right now, and type into the chat window, please type your questions here. And you should see that message pop up momentarily. You can type these questions at any point during the session. We will wait to answer content-related questions until after the presentation. What we'll do for Q&A is that I will read out the questions aloud to our presenters so they can answer them. Also, if you should require any technical assistance today, one of my colleagues at the International Institute for Sustainable Development is available to help you, Pauline Gerard. Thanks, Pauline, for helping out today. To get in touch with her, please message her directly using the chat software. You can select her name and message her privately. You can also email her at the address that's on the screen right now. And in a moment, I'll also put that email into the chat box so that you will have it once I change the slide. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and pass the control over to Nancy. It'll just take a minute to transition here, and then Nancy can take it away and tell us about Great Lakes indicators. Nancy?
All right. Thank you, Carla. And thanks to everyone who joined in to listen to this presentation. So as Carla said, my name is Nancy Stadler-Salt, and I'm the Canadian lead for the Great Lakes indicator work. But before I begin, I just wanted to say that the Great Lakes indicator work would not be possible without the support of many people and agencies on both sides of the border. And for that, I'm very, very grateful. So with this presentation today, I hope that I can give you a bit of an insight into our program and some of the challenges we have faced along the way, and then finish up with some recommendations for those who are either already using indicators to assess an ecosystem or embarking upon that journey. But one thing I wanted to let everyone know is that I'm not going to talk about the actual results of the latest assessment of the Great Lakes. That was covered by Stacy Sherwati-Pergentile, and she covered that beautifully in her presentation to the CSIN group on January 30th. And as far as I understand, and I did check this out earlier this week, that presentation is available on the CSIN website. So before we begin, I also want to mention that in this presentation, I'll often refer to SOLEC, or State of the Lakes Ecosystem Conference. I'll also refer to State of the Great Lakes reporting and Great Lakes indicators. These are all interlinked, and each is an important part of the process to be able to assess the health of the Great Lakes ecosystem. So SOLAC and State of the Great Lakes reporting have been in existence since 1994, and at first, indicators were used to assess the Great Lakes ecosystem. Those indicators were ad hoc. They were identified as they were needed. The idea was then to bring some consistency to the reporting process, but that didn't happen until around 1998. And at that time, we started developing the first Great Lakes Indicator Suite. But as you will hear as I go along, the process isn't static, and we are continually looking to improve our assessment process and reporting. So let's begin. All right. So this is, I want to first of all welcome you to the Great Lakes for those of you who are from outside of the Great Lakes region. And on this slide, this is a view that Chris Hadfield, our Canadian astronaut, would have experienced from the International Space Station about once every 90 minutes or so. So it's quite a spectacular view. And then this image is from February 19th of this year. So it's a fairly recent winter view taken from a satellite, but it's showing that even from space, it looks cold and icy in the Great Lakes region. And then on this slide, this is how we typically view the Great Lakes. There's all kinds of lines and labels on and around them showing countries, provinces, states, cities, borders, and even the watershed boundary, and that's the green area on this image. As you can imagine, all this dividing up creates a big challenge when we're trying to get information on the Great Lakes. I'm going to come back to this slide later in my presentation, but at this time I just wanted you to recognize that the Great Lakes are shared waters. They're shared between 2 countries, 2 provinces, 8 states, and a multitude of local level jurisdictions. And of course, we also share the Great Lakes with all the native species that live in the region. So on this slide, I just want to show a few interesting facts about the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes contain 84% of North America's surface freshwater and 18% of the world's surface freshwater. So if you just pause and think about that, that's 1/5 of the world's easily accessible freshwater right here in the Great Lakes. I just want to stress that's, how important it is to protect this ecosystem. The Great Lakes hold 22.7 quadrillion liters. I have no idea how many zeros that would be after this number, but obviously quite a lot. But if you were to spread the water of Lake Superior alone out over North and South America, it would be about 30 centimeters deep. So that's quite astounding. The retention time of Lake Superior is about 190 years. So that means when a drop of water enters the lake around Thunder Bay or Duluth, it takes 190 years of meandering through this massive lake before it exits out at Sault Ste. Marie. That's incredible. Unfortunately, that also means that contaminants that enter the lake stay there for quite a while. Lake Erie, on the other hand, is a whole different story with a retention time of under 3 years. When you're looking at shoreline length, the total length of the Great Lakes coastline is over 16,000 kilometers. To put that into perspective, the coastline of Prince Edward Island is 805 kilometers. And if we were to stretch out the total length of the Great Lakes coastline, it would stretch to be about 40% of the Earth's circumference. The Great Lakes also sustain over 350 species of fish, including lake sturgeon, which have been here for over 10,000 years, although they have never caught one that's that old. There are many significant ecosystems in the Great Lakes region, including over 217,000 hectares of coastal wetlands, over 31,000 islands, including Manitoulin, the world's largest freshwater island, the largest collection of freshwater sand dunes, and the world's largest freshwater estuary, Green Bay. And then, of course, we can't forget about us. The Great Lakes region is home to 40 million people in total. In fact, about 30% of the total Canadian population lives in the Great Lakes Basin. So do the Great Lakes live up to their collective name? I certainly think so. So why do we want to assess the Great Lakes ecosystem? We know that the Great Lakes are great, but how do we know if they're going to stay that way? How do we know if we have pushed them beyond the point of no return? How do we know if our collective programs or activities are making a difference? How do we know if things are getting better or worse? Can we swim in the water? Can we eat the fish we catch? Can we drink the water? How can we answer the question, how are the Great Lakes doing? To answer these questions and many more, we need to assess the condition and trends of the Great Lakes ecosystem. So before I get into the challenges of doing that, I need to cover a bit of process to tell you how we assess the Great Lakes ecosystem. And then we'll look at some of the challenges that are faced along the way. So how do we assess the Great Lakes ecosystem? We do this through the creation and use of an indicator suite. So an indicator suite contains indicators that reflect ecosystem quality or trends in quality. This is useful information for managers and scientists. The suite should provide an overview of conditions in the Great Lakes at the right scale. The suite should provide consistent information about major ecosystem components for now and the future, so we can track trends and do comparisons from reporting cycle to reporting cycle. The suite should lead to efficient allocation of resources for data collection, evaluation, and reporting. Monitoring is expensive, and governments want to devote scarce resources to the most efficient and useful data collection and reporting efforts. Indicators help us to do this. And also, the suite should assist to reach consensus on information needed for multiple Great Lakes programs. The many Great Lakes programs require a basis for coordinated and collaborative monitoring programs that will meet multiple program needs. Agencies want to collect the data once and make them available to many users. Once again, Great Lakes indicators can help this. So we want the indicators to bring consistency to our ecosystem assessments and reporting. We want the suite to be comprehensive enough to assess a complex ecosystem, and we want the process to be collaborative, or in other words, we want to engage and involve our many partners. Sorry, I went ahead a slide there. So with the help of subject experts, we developed a suite of indicators to report on key ecosystem components. We didn't want to start from scratch or recreate the wheel. A lot of good thinking and work had already been done with respect to indicators. So we mined existing documents, and we started with a database of over 850 indicators. Then we selected appropriate indicators from this list, revised some, combined others, and in some cases created new indicators to better meet our needs. We whittled the initial list down to about 80 indicators. We also identified a framework for organizing the indicators to meet our needs. In the Great Lakes indicator work, we have adjusted this over time. We started with geographic areas and environmental issues as an organizing framework. We moved to a pressure state response framework. Then we modified that to the driving forces, pressure, state, impacts, and response, or DIPSR framework. And we are currently working against a goal matrix framework of environmental objectives as called for in the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Overall, a framework helps you to organize the indicators so you can ensure that you cover all the key pieces and that the indicators are linked but should not be duplicative. So here's an example of a goal matrix framework. From the Great Lakes perspective, the goal to restore and maintain the Great Lakes, as called for in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, does not imply a return to the conditions of the 1700s. The lake's ecosystems have been altered way too much for that to happen. Rather, the major goals for the Great Lakes are influenced by a combination of stressors that are being applied to them and the values that society holds for the uses of the Great Lakes. For the major goals, quantifiable ecosystem objectives can be identified, and for each of the objectives, one or more indicators can be measured to assess progress towards that objective. Attainment of the ecosystem objectives should result in attainment of the major goals. Indicators help us determine how we are doing in meeting targets and objectives. So the overall goals and objectives for the Great Lakes are largely determined by an overarching Great Lakes Agreement between Canada and the United States called the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was first signed in 1972 by Canada and the United States, who are also known as the parties to the agreement. It was amended and re-signed in 1978 and again in 1987, each time improving the agreement and broadening the scope. The agreement commits the parties to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters of the Great Lakes. The agreement was recently amended in 2012 and now includes 9 general objectives that the two countries are committed to reporting progress against using a suite of science-based ecosystem indicators. So once we had the first suite of Great Lakes indicators identified, we then needed to actually report on them. In order to do that, we needed to identify indicator authors. And for most indicators, we tried to find 2 authors, one Canadian and one American. And we looked for these experts from the appropriate agencies and organizations around the Great Lakes Basin. Although most experts contacted agreed to do this work, we recognized that this work was in essence volunteer work. It was sort of at the side of their desk, and it was not generally in people's work plans in the early days. So this step relied on our personal networks, good working relationships, and lots of communication. After the indicator authors did their work, a core team of Environment Canada and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency staff reviewed all the indicators and synthesized and assessed the information into manageable chunks, such as Great Lakes issues, or even overarching categories of chemical, physical, and biological integrity. We kept in touch with the subject experts to ensure our overall assessments were agreed to. Next, we identified audiences and methods for reporting. We first present our Great Lakes assessments at a State of the Lakes Ecosystem Conference, or SOLEC, attended by environmental managers and scientists. Once we have general consensus by our Great Lakes partners that the assessments are right, then we start to develop our various reports for different audiences. So after consideration of comments, we begin to produce the reports. Our 2 main reports are shown on this slide. So all of the individual indicator reports, and there were 53 of them in 2011, are packaged into the State of the Great Lakes report, which is the left one. And this is a lengthy and technical document. The audience for this report is generally scientists, academia, and environmental managers. A State of the Great Lakes highlights report is also produced. That's the report on the right side. Although they look pretty much identical, they're greatly different. So the highlights report is a 16 to 20 page high-level synthesis and assessment of the Great Lakes ecosystem. The audience for this is much broader and includes the interested public as well as senior management of all the Great Lakes agencies and organizations. Other reports have included background papers on various Great Lakes issues of concern and shorter fact sheets on individual issues or even individual lake. The fact sheets have been tailored for a broader, more public audience, yet delve into a little more detail on a certain issue than the highlights report would. So the indicators are continually reviewed, and improvements and revisions are made through various peer reviews and discussions. The indicator process is ongoing and is never static. This is a continual cycle of review, revise, and so forth. The addition or removal of indicators from the suite is done as warranted, and in doing so, consensus on the indicators is built and fosters collaboration and cooperation amongst the Great Lakes stakeholders. As mentioned, we first present our State of the Great Lakes information at SOLIC, which is attended by environmental managers and scientists. We consider this a peer review of sorts, and it helps us know if we got the assessments right. There's lots of opportunity for feedback at the conference itself and during a period following the conference as well. This is one opportunity for feedback on the indicators and assessments, which happens every reporting cycle, and that's every 3 years. This is a regular opportunity to provide comments. Once comments have been considered and incorporated as appropriate, then we begin to develop the reports. We also have organized fulsome reviews of the indicator suite, both the suite in its entirety as well as the individual indicators. The two earlier reviews in 2003, 2004, and 2010 included indicator experts from outside of the indicator team, and with a few experts even coming from outside of the Great Lakes Basin. Both of these reviews improved and strengthened the suite of indicators as well as the process. The recent review in 2014 was driven both by the commitments under the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and also by the parties' consideration of work done by the International Joint Commission to streamline the suite of indicators. This review again has improved the indicator cycle and reduced the number to 43 indicators. These fulsome reviews are periodic, and we decide to do them when we need a more complete review is required or something triggers the review, such as the amended Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So as you can see at the bottom of this slide, one of our sort of guiding principle is review, revise, report, and repeat. So we're constantly going through that cycle. So in summary, we have a binational system of ecosystem indicators used to assess the conditions and trends of the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem. It's hoped that the indicators can provide information to influence environmental management decisions in the Great Lakes. The indicator system is flexible. We're always considering ways to improve, and it's also transparent. We communicate what we are doing and why as much as we can. To improve the system of indicators and the reporting as well, we have the regular ongoing reviews every cycle, plus the periodic, more fulsome reviews. These are both important to ensure that the suite of indicators remains current, relevant, and useful for assessing the Great Lakes ecosystem, and that we are providing the right information to those who make decisions that impact the Great Lakes ecosystem. So now we're going to start talking about some of the challenges that we have experienced along the way, followed by some recommendations. So the first area of challenges is the indicators themselves. The number of indicators has been a challenge for us, and we've been asked to come up with fewer and fewer of indicators to assess the Great Lakes ecosystem. As you can imagine, this ecosystem is complex, and the fewer indicators you have, the more likely you are to miss a key component in your assessment. So this is a real challenge to find the balance between having the right amount of information without it being an overwhelming amount of information. The next challenge is ownership. one way for SOLEC and the Great Lakes indicators to be sustained and the indicators to be fully implemented is for each indicator to have a sponsor, or in other words, an agency or organization that commits to gathering the data, analyzing and interpreting them, and reporting on the indicator through SOLEC. So far, SOLEC's relied on personal contact and individual expertise for the indicator reports, but agency commitments would provide more consistency over time. And then criteria. For SOLEC, a set of criteria are used and applied to candidate indicators. The overriding criteria are those of necessary, sufficient, and feasible. Is each indicator needed, or is there some redundancy in the set? Are all the indicators taken as a whole sufficient to characterize the Great Lakes ecosystem components, or are some elements missing? And is the indicator feasible to measure and report? So these are some key considerations and also reasons why we're continually reviewing the indicator suite. Continuing on this challenge area of indicators, we also have the assessments. We have many partners involved, and each partner has their own position on assessments. So getting people to agree to assessment potentially could be challenging, but we try to maintain that you can't argue with what the science is telling us. So the second challenge area was about data and monitoring programs. So with this area, obviously, because we're talking about the whole Great Lakes ecosystem, we would like to have basin-wide coverage. So we're working at the scale of the Great Lakes Basin, and we need data that covers the whole Great Lakes Basin. So that's a lot of ground, or I guess you could say that's a lot of water to cover, and not a lot of programs have this geographic coverage. Also, the indicators are binational, and in a perfect world, our data sets would be binational as well, but that doesn't happen very often. We do have a few examples of binational data sets, but those are few and far between. So generally, we look for cooperative work, and in the Great Lakes region, we have the Cooperative Science and Monitoring Initiative to help with this, so that the data is collected and analyzed in the same or similar way, or that we can find and use data that is complementary to each other. We also need data that are comparable. So when the data are not exactly comparable, though, we hope that the trends are indicating the same thing. And if they aren't, then we have a problem, and that is indicating an area that we need to do some further investigation. Also, high-quality data is essential with some quality assurance and quality control. We need to have confidence that the data have been properly vetted. But this piece, the quality assurance and the quality control, resides with the data holders, so those who are collecting the data. The data should also be as up-to-date as possible, because it's no good reporting on an ecosystem component with data that's 10 or 15 years old. So generally, we're using data that's been collected about 2 years ago. Then it goes through the quality assurance, quality control process, and it's analyzed. So there's a bit of a lag time before we can actually see the results of the data, the information that comes from that data. Also, continuing with the data challenges, sustainability. Data that's not sustainable, in other words, not an ongoing monitoring program supported by an agency or organization, is not as useful over the long term. So part of the indicator work is to identify long-term trends, and sometimes that's that is over the span of years to decades. Filling data gaps. The indicator suite has a few indicators that we are unable to report out on at this time because we don't have data for them. This information has been determined to be important in an assessment of the Great Lakes ecosystem. So this is one real challenge that we haven't wrestled to the ground yet, but we continue to express the importance for that specific information. So the SOLIC indicators were developed and selected based on the criteria of necessary and sufficient, as I mentioned earlier, not on the basis of monitoring programs already in place. And we know that monitoring agencies have their own mandates for data collection, excuse me, and they do not necessarily have the resources or the motivation to redirect their established programs to new indicators. At least they can't do that very quickly. And then the recognition that SOLIC itself is not a monitoring program, but relies on existing monitoring program. Our intent is to identify the data needed, find out who is collecting the data, and then have those data shared and reported out to multiple audiences. And, excuse me again, scale is very important. SOLIC looks at the scale of the whole Great Lakes Basin and also each individual Great Lake or major embayment and the connecting channels. So this slide is just showing the differences of scale with the focus on the basin-wide scale as if you're looking down from a space shuttle, and the lake-wide scale as if you're looking down from an airplane. We may make use of data collected at the local level by aggregating them up to a larger scale, but we don't intend to count and report on every frog in every pond. And then challenge area number 3, working with partners. With respect to reporting on indicators, life would be so much easier if you're the only player in town and you could develop your own indicators, do your own assessments, and then decide on the follow-up actions on your own. But it doesn't work like that. And actually, you know, with the multitude of partners that we have in the Great Lakes region, it actually strengthens the work that we do. So our partners are great, they're involved and engaged, and the majority are actively looking for ways to work together to achieve the common goal. But just the simple fact of the number of partners that we're working with has its own challenges. And you can consider that each partner may have different priorities, different mandates, different reporting requirements. And we're dealing with somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 partners, so that can be quite a challenge. So even within a single organization, there can be challenges as well. As mentioned earlier, we can reach binational agreement on a suite of indicators to use for reporting on the Great Lakes ecosystem, but then we can have other indicator requirements placed on us by our own agencies and our own government's needs, which can differ in terms of the indicators and the frequency of reporting. Okay, so I showed this slide earlier on in my presentation. I just want to revisit it and put a little more detail behind the complexity of this multi-jurisdictional region. So governance in the Great Lakes Basin is complex. There's 2 countries involved, each of which has several federal agencies with jurisdiction over some aspects of the lakes. For example, in Canada, we have Environment Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Health Canada, Agriculture Canada, Transportation Canada. In the U.S., we have the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Park Service, the Coast Guard, et cetera, et cetera. There's also, on the Canadian side, 2 provinces, and there on the U.S. side, 8 U.S. states. So each of the provinces and states also has multiple agencies, including the provincial or state equivalent of an environmental quality agency and a natural resource management agency. On the Ontario side, there's 41 public health units, and these units monitor swimming beaches, as an example, and drinking water quality, among other things. Then on the U.S. side, there's 83 counties that border the Great Lakes, and their county health departments monitor the swimming beaches. So, you know, just massive numbers of organizations and jurisdictions to work with. And then, of course, we also have the tribes, First Nations. In the U.S., there's 29 tribes with independent governance in the Great Lakes Basin. And in Canada, the relationship between the federal government and First Nations is a bit more complex, but there's 64 recognized First Nations on the Ontario side of the Great Lakes Basin. And then, of course, if that's in itself is not enough, all that I've just mentioned, the 2 countries have established special binational commissions, such as the International Joint Commission to assess progress under the Water Quality Agreement, and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission to control sea lamprey and also to promote a multi-use fishery. So if it sounds complicated, that's because it is. So now, just moving to a few recommendations. First of all, recommend that groups take the time to get buy-in and support. It doesn't come overnight. In our situation, or in our case, a binational multi-agency steering committee was invaluable help for us to get that buy-in and support. Identify an operating framework that you want to work under. It helps to identify gaps as well as duplication in your indicator suite. Identify those agencies and organizations that are critical for your success. For example, those with data monitoring programs, expertise, environmental management at the appropriate scale, and then work on building relationships with them. Provide opportunities for feedback and review. This is really important for success. But not only providing those opportunities, you need to listen to the advice that you get back and figure out how and where you can incorporate it. Sell your work. Take every opportunity you can to go and speak about your work at the appropriate meetings and events. Again, this is about communicating and communicating what you are trying to do, and the more people who know about it, the better. And lastly, the last recommendation I put here is know thyself. This is a key recommendation, to be clear about the process and what your system can and can't do, and to be open and transparent in your efforts. For example, early on in the SOLEC process, we developed some guiding principles. So we identified a list of items that represent what SOLEC is or does. So, for example, SOLEC gathers data from existing monitoring programs. So there's a lot of monitoring activity in the Great Lakes Basin for all sorts of purposes, and SOLEC taps into the data being collected. SOLEC relies on partnerships and collaboration. It's actually a rather low-budget operation. It's all the collaboration that makes it as successful as it is. So each stakeholder contributes a little and hopefully receives a lot in return. SOLEC represents the combined voice of Canada and the U.S. And one of our products is the government's report to the people. SOLIC assesses a suite of Great Lakes ecosystem components, as well as stressors, so things like toxic chemicals, invasive species, and climate change. SOLIC also tries to provide useful assessments on the state of the ecosystem to environmental managers and decision makers at all levels of government, and also to the general public. So not only do we know what SOLIC does, we've also identified what SOLIC does not or is not. So SOLIC is not a regulatory program. SOLIC can't tell anyone what to do. SOLIC is not a lake management program. It's a reporting venue. So lake management comes from the specific lake management programs and the various agencies with defined mandates. SOLIC isn't a monitoring program. SOLIC depends on data from these programs, but it's not in charge of monitoring itself. SOLIC's not a scientific research program. We may periodically sponsor some research related to indicators, but it's not a research funding program. And SOLIC's not a scientific research conference. There are other conferences to fill this role, and SOLIC has a focus on the state of the environment with an eye towards management implications. SOLIC also does not set endpoints and standards. We use the existing endpoints and standards as references to interpret indicator data, but we don't establish them. SOLIC doesn't set lake-wide goals. There are, as I mentioned, lake-wide management programs to do this, and also the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement for setting goals and objectives. SOLIC doesn't dictate to monitoring programs. We can't tell them what to do. We can ask, we can beg, we can plead, but we can't dictate. SOLIC doesn't only assess toxic substances, which is one of the early focuses of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, but SOLIC looks comprehensively at the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem, including many stressors on the environment. And kind of lastly, and a very key point here, SOLIC doesn't maintain a centralized repository for Great Lakes data. The data remain with the various agencies and organizations that conduct the monitoring, and we'll put people in contact with the appropriate agency if they need more detail than what's provided in an indicator report, but we don't manage the data itself. Okay, and so to finish up, here's just a couple of reminders. Ecosystems are complex, and any single indicator can't be completely representative of all conditions. You also have to remember that you can't be all things to all people. So again, identifying what your program is setting out to do and sticking with it is a good thing. You can't please everyone. We've heard everything from we have way too many indicators to we don't have enough detail. So I think that happy middle ground is when you're getting comments that say both all the time. Then we think we're probably hitting the mark where we need to be. And then lastly, focus on what you should be doing and don't get distracted by what others think you should be doing. In our case, we have the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which commits the governments of Canada and the United States to establish and maintain comprehensive science-based ecosystem indicators to assess the state of the Great Lakes. And so with this 2012 agreement, it is now written in stone. So that, for us, is a good thing. And that is it. So thanks, everyone. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Hopefully we now have a couple minutes for questions.
Hi, thanks, Nancy. Can you hear me? Yep, okay, someone told me that they could hear me. That was really fascinating, and I imagine that the lessons you've learned are applicable to the work done by many of the people on the webinar. I know it reminded me of a process we're involved in right now, helping a group work with some data where they can literally churn out thousands of pages, but they're wanting to boil it down to indicators that can be considered by the public, by policymakers, and that sounds like that's the sort of thing that you're doing. So with that, I'd like to ask people to please type their questions into the chat box, and we do have a few minutes for them. I'm willing to go a few minutes over time if Nancy's able to stay on the line, and we'd like to field as many questions as we can. The first question is one that we were trying to answer earlier when we had a slight interruption in the webinar. How are the SOLIC indicators connected to the lamps, and do they use the same indicators?
It's a good question. At this time, I would say that some of the lamps are using some of the indicators from the SOLIC suite. However, what we've envisioned for as we move forward together in the future is that there would be a core set of indicators from SOLIC that apply to all the individual lakes, and then each lake as required or as necessary, because each of the Great Lakes is unique, would get into specific issues that may not be applicable to the other Great Lakes and may require additional indicator development for their assessment of their particular lake. So we're still trying to make those connections stronger, and with this new water quality agreement, we also have the requirement, the commitment to develop lake ecosystem objectives for each individual Great Lake. Those can be used to connect the indicators as well between SOLIC and the lake-wide management programs.
Okay, and you predicted someone else's question there. Want to come in adding on to that last question, how will SOLIC indicators be related to lake ecosystem objectives? Well, I believe you just answered that. Good job. The next question is around financing. Resources are always a challenge for governments, for watershed groups, for everyone. How have you determined sharing of financing of these activities?
We haven't determined any sharing of financing for the indicators. As I mentioned in my presentation, there are a few indicators that are sitting that we haven't been able to report out on them because there isn't any data for them or a monitoring program. However, it was determined through the development process that they were important pieces of information. We have to, as part of the selling, I guess, is that we have to develop a message to take up to the managers to say, you know, this piece of information is really important, here's why, and then identify the costs of a monitoring program. We recognize that money is tight right now. Chances of just developing a new monitoring program are pretty slim. Chances are probably a bit better if we can modify an existing monitoring program if it would better meet our needs as well as the needs of others. But we haven't really looked at identifying what the finances would be to develop new monitoring programs to meet our additional needs.
Okay. Fair enough. Let me see what other questions are coming in here. Where would you ideally like to see the state of the Great Lakes indicators be in the next 10 to 15 years? What types of developments would you like to see?
That's a good question. I think that we, as I mentioned in the presentation, we are now working towards reporting against 9 general objectives in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So we're adjusting to be able to report out against those. So that's a new shift for us, and this next reporting cycle, which will be 2016, will be starting that, and then we have to kind of finesse and polish it, to take a couple of cycles, since this will be a big shift in how we report. It'll take probably a couple of cycles to get it right. So our focus in the immediate short term is reporting against that new framework. However, I think that we will also recognize that that's one reporting framework, and we'll need to figure out how to meet other reporting frameworks, such as the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the Great Lakes, that there may still be a need for that. So I guess in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to be sorting through what are the needs of the environmental managers from our reporting system, as well as the public, in reporting out to the public. What's the most useful way to be pulling this information together to report out, to provide the public with information on how are the Great Lakes doing.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. And it's now noon Central Time. Oh, no, one more question just did come in. In the new framework, will the individual indicator assessment categories remain the same? So status, fair, poor, et cetera, trend, improving, and degrading?
Yes, it will. We are keeping the status as good, fair, and poor, and the trends as improving, unchanging, and deteriorating for the majority of the indicators. There are a few indicators where those rankings don't apply, such as, for example, water levels. It's hard to put an assessment of good, fair, or poor to high water levels or low water levels. That's an assessment where we are going to use rankings such as near the long-term average, above long-term average, or below long-term average, instead of good, fair, and poor. But in general, yes, we will be sticking with the good, fair, and poor, and improving, unchanging, and deteriorating.
Oh, that's a good point about the water levels. I had not thought of that before. So I think that's, we'll wrap up the questions now. It's 12 in Central Time, 1 Eastern Time. I've learned a lot today about Great Lakes indicators, and also about troubleshooting webinar software. So thank you so much for joining us today, Nancy, and for offering to do a second webinar so we can have two. We had the January 30th one, giving the overview of the program, and then yours today, delving more into depth around questions around indicators. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting both myself, and I'll speak on behalf of Stacy as well.
It was a pleasure having you both. I'm now just going to take back control of the screen for a moment to give people a bit of information on some CSIN news. For most of you are actually still with us. I'll keep this brief. Just let me share my screen here. So we have a workshop coming up next week that some of you may have already registered for, but for those of you who haven't, I'd like to give you a bit more information. So the workshop's called Discussing Sustainability Indicators in Canada. This Canadian Sustainability Indicators Network event will explore indicator best practices, common problems-related indicators, and possible solutions to address problems. So some of you might have seen an email from me about this, and you might have already registered. If you haven't registered and would like to, please email me at the address on the bottom of the screen, kzabricki@iisd.ca. The registration deadline is March 3rd. That's next Tuesday. There are a few ways you can attend. You can attend virtually from anywhere you have an internet connection, as we're enabling webinar screen sharing for this event. And then for that case, the audio will be through the phone. For attending in person, the workshop is being facilitated in Ottawa-Gatineau by my IISD colleague, Livia Bizikova. And I believe there are still a few spaces left to attend in person, so please email me if that interests you. And if you're in Winnipeg, you can join me at the IISD head office. I'll be connecting to Ottawa via both video conference and webinar. And then there's also the possibility to connect via another video conferencing program if you have access to one. But a test would be required in advance to ensure it would work. So if connecting by video conference interests you, please let me know as soon as possible so we can arrange a test. So again, if you're interested in participating in the workshop, please let me know. Send me an email. We'd love to have you attend and share your insights next Friday. Some of the time zones are on the screen. Eastern time is from 12:30 to 4:30, Central time 11:30 until 3:30. I can send you more information and an agenda if you're interested. Just shoot me an email. And with that, I think we'll wrap up this webinar. Thanks again so much to Nancy. We should have at least one more CSIN webinar in March. We're tentatively planning one for March 23rd on watershed and human health indicators. So save the date. It would be around lunch Central Time. And look in your email, keep an eye out in your email for more information on that in the near future. Thanks so much for joining us.